if you acknowledge that you find something glamorous, it makes you vulnerable because it says something about who you are. But I want people to, sort of think about what they find glamorous and learn from that.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Virginia Postrel, the author of the new book, The Power of Glamour, Longing and the Art of Visual Persuasion. Virginia, thanks for talking to us. Virginia, of course, was the editor-in-chief of Reason from 1989 to 2000. She's the person who hired me. Before that, she worked at Inc. and Wall Street Journal. She's been a columnist for The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and most recently, Bloomberg View. The author of 1998's great book, The Future and Its Enemies, as well as 2003's interesting, I wouldn't say it's a follow-up, but a great book in its own right, The Substance of Style. So, Virginia, here we are. We're talking about the power of glamour. Let's start by defining glamour. What are its characteristics and its place in our lives?
Well, the one big point of the book is that glamour is much more important than we often give it credit for. And another big point of the book is that it's not what you think. When a lot of people hear the term glamour, they think it means fashion, or they think it means things that are sparkly. Right. It's very sort of limited, superficial meanings.
But it's more of a kind of medium or a mode of expression.
But if you actually start thinking about what do you find glamorous, or what do other people find glamorous, you realize that it's much broader. And what glamour really is it's a form of communication, even rhetoric, in the same way that humor is. So you can have a comedian who's trying to be funny, or you can just have somebody say something and unintentionally be funny. But what determines whether humor is actually present is not some attempt to craft it, it's the audience's response. The audience has that sense of amusement. And the same thing is true with glamour. Glamour is identified by this sense of longing and projection, this feeling of if only I could be there, if only I could drive that car, if only I could live in that house, if only I could be that person or be with that person.
So, if we can, and I mean, we'll show this more fully, but talk a little bit about the cover image, because you do a kind of deep reading of that as well. Right. How does this incarnate a form of glamour?
Yeah, so this image, first of all, people always ask who and what it was, and a surprising number of people ask if it's me. It's not. She's like younger, thinner. Yeah. Well, actually now she's probably dead, or maybe not. But this was taken in 1947 for Harper's Bazaar. It was taken by a very interesting photographer named Tony with an I, Frisell, who gave her archive to the Library of Congress and her copyrights to the public domain with the cooperation of her children and heirs, so that they were more interested in sharing her work than in controlling whatever revenue might be generated from it. And I very much like it because although if you look at it really closely, you can kind of get a general idea of when it was. It has a timeless quality. We can't really tell. It's not obviously retro. It's not obviously contemporary. She is looking away from the camera, as is often the case in glamorous portraits, so that we can identify with her rather than relate to her.
So, I mean, in kind of film studies terms, this is not about the gaze. It's not about the male or female gaze. Right. It's you're identifying with the person. Right, you're
identifying more with the person and then following her eyes toward, she's looking away. And I think it's also kind of a double glamour thing, so that it's all in the interpretation. Right. You could think she's just being in the moment, but I think there's also a sense of longing in the picture.
Simultaneously, this is a human figure, but it's black and white. She's in tennis clothes, it looks like, but she's not sweating. Right. There's no exertion. Right. People talk, and you bring up people like Cary Grant or Fred Astaire or Ginger Rogers. I mean, these are people who seem to do things with incredible ease.
Right. The first couple of chapters are kind of what is glamour and what does it do? And what is this sense of longing and how does that relate to our underlying desires? Then what I do is I go into the essential elements that are present in all forms of glamour. And the first of those is a promise of escape and transformation. So glamour takes these sort of inchoate desires that we have, and that could be a desire for recognition, it could be a desire for friendship, it could be for love, and it could be pretty much anything. And it focuses them on an object. And in that object, we have this sense of escape and transformation.
And this could be a movie star.
It could be
an aviator.
Yeah, it could
place.
be a place.
Yeah.
It could be, Paris.
Right.
It could be
California.
It could be, two beach chairs posed, looking out at the ocean as a sort of.
And it could be an action. I mean, you talk about the glamour of smoking, which obviously that's changed.
Right.
Meaning,
yes.
but.
Yeah. And then one thing I do in each chapter is I have what I call icons, which are some archetype that is glamorous. So the first chapter, I talk about the aviator as an embodiment of glamour, and I talk about smoking. And the reason I chose those two particular ones for the first chapter is one of the messages of the first chapter is that glamour is not intrinsically feminine.
Right.
That in fact, some of the earliest uses of the term as we understand it today were quite masculine, including the idea of the aviator.
I guess Charles Lindbergh is one of the great early icons.
Right, and I also have pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen taken by Toni Frissell as well. She did very glamorous. She took her fashion skills to Italy and took these very glamorous
talk
pictures.
A bit about that, because the Tuskegee Airmen are interesting. I mean, they were a group of black pilots in World War II, and you point out that they were not particularly well known among white populations during World War II, but they were really iconic to blacks, and you hear echoes of that at the beginning of Native Son, Bigger Thomas, Richard Wright's novel, looks up and sees a plane, and throughout African American and kind of iconography, there's a lot of discussion of flight and of moving.
Well, because that is, and in fact, one of the things that is not explicit in the book, but one that I discovered, there is a theme about black Americans that runs through the book, and it makes sense because glamour is very compelling if the situation you're in is less than desirable. I mean, glamour always assumes some level of discontent in your life because you're imagining, if only for a passing moment, a different, better life and different, better circumstances. So going back to the Tuskegee Airmen, this Tuskegee Airmen were known among other African Americans during the war, and I quote a historian who has done a relatively recent book about them, saying, quoting these guys saying, the folks would do anything for you, because in that period, in the first half of the 20th century, there was nothing more representative of masculine glamour than an aviator, because they were brave, they were usually young, they were, had this sort of sense of modernity and mastery of machines that no one could, a typical person couldn't understand. In the case of a military aviator, there's also all the military glamour, which is the oldest one. And so this was, the Tuskegee Airmen were showing, at that point, mostly to other blacks, that African Americans could, get the job done, that they could be as modern, as technological, as brave as anyone else. And then also, of course, as you say, there's this sense of the airplane, the flight, the flight and transformation that's embodied in that. And as you say, most white people never knew about it until there was this all-star movie in, I think, '89, but, in relatively recent years.
I mean, when we think of Tuskegee and blacks, we think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which is kind of
I actually think of the school.
Okay, there. I mean, but I'm saying it's the, two totally diametrical kind of experiences of African Americans. Talk about how California is an embodiment of glamour.
Well, California is very interesting because it has historically embodied lots of different forms of glamour, but all of them having to do with, California is like the the edge, whether you're coming from, say China, or whether you're coming across the United States. For escape and transformation, that was the place you went to reinvent your life. And it had this sense of openness, and there was also a lot of deliberately constructed booster glamour in the early part of the 20th century, where railroads would run ads in the Chicago Tribune saying, comparing the temperatures and showing people, swimming, and there were a lot of images of orange trees and orange trees with snow-capped mountains. And there was a sense that this was sort of an earthly paradise, and you could escape to that and reinvent your life. And I tell the story of the architect Richard Neutra, who was in Europe after World War I, when everybody is very depressed, and he's dreaming of a place where he could get away from the winter and be among people who were more mentally footloose, as he puts it. He and he ends up he sees this poster in a travel office that says "California calls you," and it worked. He moved there, and then his architecture became iconic, partly through the photographs of Julius Schulman, of the sort of California good life.
So glamour is not inherently gendered as feminine. You
Right.
pointed that out. Is it inherently, and you talk a little bit about this, an urban phenomenon and a commercial phenomenon?
Well, before we get back to that, let me finish going through, because you actually asked me a question about grace, and I started by going through the three elements, and never got to grace.
Okay, sure.
So the second element is grace, which is this reason we often associate the word effortless with glamour. And glamour is an illusion. The word originally meant a literal magic spell. And what the nature of that illusion is that glamour hides difficulties. It hides costs, it hides distractions, hides anything that might detract from your ability to project yourself and to want what it is.
And you have there's a great anecdote in the story about somebody who meets Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire's great dancing partner, and she's chewing gum, and the woman is kind of like, that really ruined it for me.
Right.
And there's another line in there about how Fred Astaire, you don't see the hundreds of bloodied socks and shoes,
Right.
because he was a manic perfectionist, so he practiced all the time. And we just saw the finished product.
Right. And a lot of the book is, designed to give readers this sort of intellectual infrastructure. And so there are 3 of these, there are 4, and one of the things is I talk about a couple of kinds of grace. There is what I call theatrical grace, which is where in the moment there actually is grace. When Fred and Ginger dance, they really are graceful. But what is hidden is all the behind the scenes preparation, support, etc. And then I talk also about darkroom grace, which is when you take an image and make it better, so that that's where you retouch photos or whatever. So there's grace, and then the third characteristic is mystery, which enhances projection because it's intriguing, and also helps grace.
Right. And in this photo, we're not sure exactly what's going on.
We're not
and
sure exactly.
You talk about how sunglasses are a great way of leaving something to the imagination.
Right. And yet, the way I talk about the idea that this mystery, glamour is neither transparent nor opaque. It's translucent. So there has to be enough relatability, you have to be able to see enough to project yourself into it. And it is this, if you want to get into sort of, your literary theory ideas, there's a lot of discussion of the other in various forms of critical theory. And what I think glamour does is it allows us to see ourselves in the other, whatever that might be. Another place, it can be another person, it can be another place, it can even be an object, but there has to be something of ourselves that we see in that glamorous
And there
object.
needs to be enough particularity. It's kind of like in a novel, if there aren't enough details,
Right.
you can't inhabit the world, but if there are too many, you get bogged down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this delicate balance between the particulars and the general.
One of the things that I've found particularly fascinating is your distinctions between glamour and charisma. And you have a great chart, which I'm sure we'll be seeing all over the place, but talking about glamorous people or glamorous things versus charismatic ones. And for instance, you have Barack Obama as glamorous, Bill Clinton charismatic, Jackie Kennedy glamorous, Eleanor Roosevelt charismatic, early Princess Diana glamorous, late Princess Diana charismatic. Talk a little bit about that and how that kind of helps us understand the power of glamour.
Yeah. So glamour and charisma are often mistaken for each other, and in some people they do go together. Most politicians and most movie stars have some level of charisma or they couldn't do their job, and only a few of them are glamorous. Glamour is fundamentally in the audience. It's something that the audience feels. Like, glamour is not something you have, it's something you feel. Charisma is a personal attribute like intelligence. So a car can be glamorous, a car cannot be charismatic. So you have to have a person, and the person...
But a driver can be charismatic.
A driver can be
right.
charismatic.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to have a person, and that person carries this quality with them. And what charisma does is it sort of makes people want to follow a person, makes people, they don't identify with them. They may identify with a cause that person supports. I mean, that's the traditional idea of charisma was religious. And charisma doesn't have this great, the discussion actually occurs in the chapter on grace. The charisma doesn't have to have this grace, and in fact you can be Bill Clinton and let it all hang out, but you have this sort of personal quality that makes people want to follow you.
Talk a little bit about, I mean, I guess Obama and Clinton, it's an interesting political moment, and kind of glamour helps, you say, when you're campaigning, but then when you're ruling or when you're actually legislating, you want charisma.
Right.
Kind of tell us a little bit about how that's working for Obama.
Well, the way glamour works is the audience projects its hopes and dreams on whatever.
And this is Obama with the poster that's kind of vague. It's not quite detailed, but
2008 Obama was incredibly glamorous. The people who supported him were projecting onto this individual person everything they want in a country, what their ideals for a president, even in sometimes about their personal lives. He embodied that to his audience, and then there was also a kind of glamorous iconography. The Onion mocked his looking into the future pose, and even the logo with the sort of horizon, the road going into the distance is also glamorous, and that's great. If you can get 51% of the people to project their hopes and dreams onto you, you will win. The problem is when you become president or you get in office, you have to actually make decisions, and you have to. You can't be as vague about things, and so some of that mystery vanishes, and some of the grace vanishes, and some people get alienated. And the other thing is, people had this, they imagined that if he got elected, somehow political conflict would disappear. So that was one of his sort of promises, and racial conflict would disappear. So they kind of imagined this not only an ideal person, but kind of an ideal world. And when you get in office, that's very difficult. Whereas if you have charisma, and I mean, he has some charisma because you don't get elected president unless you have some charisma. But if you have charisma, it's much easier to persuade people to get on board with you because they like want to please you. It's not so much that they want to be you. It's like, I want that person to like me. So
somebody like Bill Clinton, I mean, when he was campaigning, and he won the first time with like 43% of the vote. He barely squeaked in. And this was a guy who had been thoroughly deconstructed as a human being. I mean, he was a philanderer, he was a liar, he was a cheater. He seemed to be constantly, coming out of the room, pulling his pants up. I mean, not glamorous at all, eating McDonald's, shoving food in his mouth. but then he could legislate. He
Right.
learned how to work.
Whether it was especially in person, but people liked him.
Yeah.
They wanted to kind of get on board with him. And obviously not everyone does.
Right.
All these people have
Right.
political opponents, but it's much easier to actually be effective in office if you're charismatic than if you're glamorous. Now,
And
occasionally there's somebody who's both.
Right, and somebody like Ronald Reagan.
Reagan had both. Mandela has both.
Right.
Although the interesting thing is, I think Mandela became glamorous because he went to prison for all those years.
Right.
He was a naturally charismatic person whose life experience, by forcing mystery onto him, made him glamorous.
And you talk about some business leaders, somebody like Steve Jobs.
Embodied both. Steve Jobs
Yeah.
is glamorous. Jeff Bezos is charismatic.
Right.
Steve Jobs was also charismatic,
Right.
but he was an interesting.
Let's talk a little bit about the subtitle of the book, Longing and the Art of Visual Persuasion. You mentioned that glamour is a form of illusion. It originally referred to a kind of magical spell. Critics like John Berger, a Marxist art critic who became a novelist, talk a lot about how glamour from a kind of Marxist or materialist framework, it gets rid of everything that's messy or complicated about a worldview or an image, and it just presents things as natural or as the way they are without talking about class relations or exploitation. In Ways of Seeing, the book that you reference, he talked about how Frans Hals, the Dutch artist, had to have hated the burghers that he was painting because they were rich and he was getting screwed by them. Talk a little bit about this, because one of the things that's interesting is that you're not saying glamour is not an illusion, but that it performs a different function for aspirational people, for poor people.
Right. So the word I use to describe John Berger is desiccated. His view is desiccated. It's not wrong entirely. There are elements of truth to it, but it's so massively oversimplified and kind of dumb, to tell you the truth, to be the one thing that anybody learns about glamour in school, if they're ever taught. Because first of all, he completely confuses social envy, which is, the envy of people in the British class system. It's also very British bound. In the British class system, who are higher up than you.
For no apparent reason.
Yeah, he confuses that desire, the desire to be like them, with every other kind of desire in the world. He is reduces everything to a kind of social envy. And then that's got two problems. First of all, there are all kinds of desires that drive glamour that have nothing to do with social envy. And the other thing is that when people find someone glamorous, they don't. Envy has this sense of resentment and wanting to tear people down. When people find someone glamorous, they don't resent them. They love them. They want to be them, or they want to be in that. They identify with them. It's a kind of identification.
Which then can also, you kind of talk about how that can be transformative, because it gives people who otherwise wouldn't have any even reason to think they might better or change their circumstances.
Right.
If you identify with a princess, you may not become a princess, but you may do something that radically alters your life.
And I tell lots of stories. It's not glamour is like any form of rhetoric. It can be either used for good purposes or bad purposes. And it also contains this illusion. So insofar as you identify with somebody or imagine yourself moving to New York or whatever, it may be positive. You may pursue a profession that you were originally inspired by a glamorous image, but at some point reality gets brought back in. So you have to put that in. But it's very reductive and very unfair to the audiences that glamour resonates with, to think that it's all about social envy. And actually, I hadn't thought about this till we were discussing it, but some of the best studies of audiences' reactions to the movies in the 30s and 40s, that sort of classic Hollywood glamour, were done of working class people in Britain, mostly women, but not entirely. And it's very clear from the things that come out of those interviews are not like, I hate the rich.
Right.
It was like, I can imagine myself having a better life. And there's a lot of feminist studies, again, mostly done by British scholars, that talk about the ways in which these images from American glamorous escapist movies served to inspire and get people through the war, the difficulties of that period, but B, give working class women a picture of a better life that they might have, and to which they
move towards, right? I mean, they insisted on.
This is not like the libertarian view, but you might say, these movies were great for the British Labour Party,
right? Because
they made people think instead of just sticking to your place, because that's the way it's always been, that hey, you should be like Joan Crawford and have a refrigerator.
No, and Joan Crawford, she's an interesting icon that you talk about again and again. She starts as a shop girl or a prostitute or a nobody, and then whether it's in Mildred Pierce or any number of other movies, she makes something of herself.
Joan Crawford role, she, it's very unfortunate that most people know, if they know anything about her, is they know Mommy Dearest.
That's right.
Because she was a really, really important icon in defining the modern woman to the general public, because she played this kind of role over and over again, which was sort of a mirror of her own life. She starts poor. She, through cunning and being ambition and drive and being savvy to the ways of men, she rises in the world and achieves some kind of material. It depends on the movie, how exactly it turns out. The movie that I talk about in some depth, because it has a great scene early on, is the movie Possessed, which is 1931.
Or 30 or
31, She also made a later movie in the 40s with the same title that's totally different. And in an early scene in this movie, she's coming home from her boring job at a box factory in some dusty, boring town. And she sees this train passing, and she looks up in the windows of the train, and there are all these sort of glamorous scenes. It's like looking at a movie. There's actually a lot of them involve the servants. There's somebody ironing, some beautiful piece of negligee. There are two cooks making a meal, and then you see this couple, beautifully attired couple, and you get that sense of her longing. And again, going back to Berger, it's not social envy. In the sense that she doesn't resent them. She wants to be in that place, and she inspires her audience to also want to be in that place.
And you talk at the very start of the book about Michalla de Prince. Talk a little bit about Michalla de Prince. It's an incredible story that really instantiates what you're talking about.
It is an amazing story. So Michalla de Prince is a dancer now. In the book, I say she's with the Harlem Dance Theater. I was told this week that she's now taking a new job in Copenhagen, but she's a young woman. But when she was 4 years old, she was living in Sierra Leone in an orphanage in a refugee camp. Her father had been murdered in the Civil War, and her mother had died of starvation. And if that isn't horrible enough, she was like the lowest on the totem pole in the orphanage, because her skin, instead of being sort of a nice even brown, had these white patches, and they called her a devil child. And she had this basically horrible life. She had one friend, but and one day this Western dance magazine blew up against the fence of the orphanage from who knows where, and on the cover of the magazine was a ballerina in the tutu and sparkling and just everything that this little girl's life was not. And she immediately identified with that, wanted to be that, and she tore off the cover and she kept it. And she had no place to store her belongings, no backpack, no drawers, anything. So she actually kept it in her underwear, because that was the only private place she had. And every night she would look at it, and it would be sort of her refuge from this very difficult circumstance. And she was fortunate enough that not too long after this happened, an American couple came to the orphanage and was going to actually adopt one of the other little girls, but ended up adopting both of them. And she showed this, tattered magazine cover to her new mother. And so when she moved back to New Jersey, she started studying dance. But she says things like, it saved me. It took her away from these difficult circumstances. It was this ridiculously glamorous image of, at some level an absurd thing for a girl in those circumstances to aspire to, but it was incredibly
Now, we
positive.
should point out that not every girl who wants to be a ballerina will grow up to be
right.
one. But yeah,
Listen, Anne Frank had posters of movie stars up and princesses in Secret Annex, and it was, I'm sure, very positive on a day-to-day basis, but didn't save her life.
But the larger point here, which is, it shows that Berger is wrong sociologically in that the audience actually is thinking differently than he supposes or he wants them to, and so that speaks to your thesis that the glamour is actually in the audience response.
Right, and in the book, the story that I tell sort of to deflate Berger is actually about Naomi Wolf and her article that she wrote about Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that.
So in 2009, Naomi Wolf wrote an article about Angelina Jolie in Harper's Bazaar, and it was a very unusual celebrity profile because they never met. It was really about the meanings that Naomi Wolf projects onto Angelina Jolie. And I argue that it's, one of the most revelatory articles about movie star glamour, because it really, tells you how movie star glamour works by having somebody write about how it worked on her. Right. And she projects, at some levels it's insane. Right. She projects all of these things and how she became, when Angelina Jolie learned to fly her private plane, which is the most infamous passage in the thing. She represented single mother chic, which is really interesting because, Naomi Wolf was a single mother, and it's very much her projecting her identity onto Angelina Jolie, who was barely single, and also sort of, the traditional aviatrix glamorous person is Amelia Earhart, but she was married with no kids, so that's no good for Naomi Wolf.
It didn't work out all that well.
Right.
But there's definitely an Ahab quality of Ahab sees Ahab everywhere. Naomi Wolf, or actually individual audience people, you make it what you want it to be.
You're seeing yourself in the other.
Well, you also talk about Oprah Winfrey and the opening. This is the book is filled with these great kind of momentary insights about how Oprah talked about the opening to the Mary Tyler Moore show, and the Mary Tyler Moore opening is kind of glamorous, even though the show is about a woman who is struggling to make it in a man's world, who lives in an attic apartment. It's not a glamorous life, but the opening is kind of. And Oprah read the. Well,
it's not intended to be a glamorous life, but if you're living the life that Oprah Winfrey was living as a teenager who was being, sexually abused and was horribly poor, it would be a glamorous life. But so Oprah Winfrey as a teenager was completely enamored of the Mary Tyler Moore show. She wanted to be, she said that she wanted to be Mary. She wanted to have Mr. Grant as her boss. She wanted to live where Mary lived. And there was also this whole confusion in her mind between Mary Richards, the character, and Mary Tyler Moore, the actress. But it was tremendously inspiring to her. And in fact, as is often the case when people are inspired by glamorous career images, she pursued that career. She and then once eventually she became successful as a talk show host, she actually made a version, which you can see on YouTube, of herself in the opening credits of the Mary Tyler Moore. So she's playing the Mary role, and she throws her hat in the air, and she's coming to Chicago instead of Minneapolis. But it's a really interesting example of somebody identifying with somebody who had certain characteristics in common with her. She could see herself in this other person, and it was inspiring.
So, on the one hand, glamour or elements of glamour seem to be everywhere around us. Like humor, I mean, it's a means of communication or expression that is everywhere, and it seems like, as with whether it's vegetables in the produce aisle or whatever, I mean, the amounts or the types of glamour are multiplying. There are more sources of it, more possibilities for it. And on the other hand, it also seems like we're in an age of total deconstruction, where no image is able to stay kind of perfect or composed for very long until you start to say, okay, well, no, in fact, Bill Clinton was this, or Oprah's childhood was this, or the glamour. We as much as we like to inhabit glamorous images or a glamorous mentality, we also want to see how it's put together and how it's not really what it is. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, glamour is very fragile because it does contain this element of illusion, and yet at the same time, the mystery is so intriguing, so that when something is glamorous, often you want to know more, and to the degree you actually inquire, the glamour is likely to vanish because the illusion.
When you were in the book, when I was reading about Joan Crawford, it's okay, so you start with 1931, and then I think it was either her last movie or last one was Trog, a movie where she finds a caveman. I mean, it's like a sub-Hammer horror movie, and it's kind of like Joan Crawford, ladies and gentlemen, and then Mommy Dearest after that. So there is that element.
And this is actually that story is one reason why people who die young are often stay glamorous, or if you can't die young, you can do what Greta Garbo did, which is just sort of disappear from the public eye. We talked about Barack Obama. Barack Obama can't stay glamorous in the way that JFK stayed glamorous because fortunately he hasn't been assassinated. If JFK had served into a second term, a tremendous amount of stuff that is highly unsavory, not to mention policy screw-ups, would have come out, and he wouldn't be the sort of glamorous figure.
As I was reading through a lot of this, I thought a lot about David Bowie, the rock star, who's mentioned in the book. He's in the index once, but what's interesting, he's projected a series of kind of glamorous images. Certainly audiences find them glamorous, but they've also changed over time.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about, because part of what your book is about, it's not that people search for the one glamorous image or identity they want to hold on forever, but it's actually kind of sequential. And it seems somebody like Bowie, who's gone through various career phases and identities, embodies that in a way that perhaps somebody like Bruce Springsteen, who is kind of stuck, like he found his working man guy, and he's staying with that. So could you talk a little bit about sequential glamour?
There's two things. First of all, glamour is always changing because the audience's aspirations change. So there's certain types of glamour that are or sort of that occur often, like people wish they were rich, so luxuries can be glamorous, although what is a luxury may change over time. But so I talk about how there's like the Rat Pack glamour in the 50s, but that's replaced by rock star glamour, and maybe the Rat Pack has
and somebody like Sinatra by the end of the 60s is a ridiculous figure.
Right.
But then comes back as an archetype of cool.
Right, exactly. So there's often this sort of, it disappears and then it comes back. Bowie is interesting in a couple of ways. One is the way you mentioned, which is that by changing, he can embody different things that different audiences at different times find compelling. The other is that somebody who has that chameleon-like quality preserves their mystery in a different way from just the, I'm not telling you anything way, because they're changeable and you don't feel like you ever know everything about them. And in the mystery chapter, one of the things that I do is I take things that are actual aesthetic tropes that are associated with glamour, like shadow or sparkle, and take them from the sort of literal to the metaphorical and say, well, these are different ways of creating mystery.
One of the interesting kind of dichotomies in what you're writing about, there's glamour And then is it necessarily opposed to authenticity, which would, which kind of implies that you're always the same person through time and space, or that you want the same things? And it seems glamour on a lot of levels allows you to inhabit, to try on things and change.
Right. That's definitely true. I mean, we can have a whole discussion about what is authenticity, this word people throw around a lot. But no, one thing that glamour does is it lets us inhabit different personas or different realities, often just for a moment. I mean, we keep talking about, because it's compelling, Oprah Winfrey sees this glamorous image and shapes her life around. Most of the time, we don't act on glamour. We just enjoy it. But it can reveal different aspects of ourselves. And the thing that I say about glamour is an illusion that tells the truth about desire. So what we find glamorous tells us something about who we are and what we want. And often, one reason people don't like glamour, I sort of argue, I think, is that if you acknowledge it, if you acknowledge that you find something glamorous, it makes you vulnerable, because it says something about who you are and your susceptibility to, whatever, that could be embarrassing. And the fact that you sort of really have these desires, or you really identify with whatever, can be, can make you vulnerable. But I want people to, sort of think about what they find glamorous and learn from that.
Well, let's talk about it in connection. This book, The Power of Glamour, in connection to your previous work. The book before this was The Substance of Style, which kind of talked about a kind of new broad-based appreciation for an interest in design elements, in everything from toothpicks to stationery. Things that we would take for granted. What is what are kind of kind of go Marxist for a little bit, what are the economic material conditions that allow for something like The Substance of Style, like for a focus on design, which then gives rise in a lot of ways to an emphasis on glamour?
Well, I really think the two books are about very different things, because The Substance of Style, first of all, is very unglamorous. It's about bringing style into areas that are not like traditionally stylish. Toilet brushes, business chips, hotels, consumer electronics, which now we take for granted that, of course, your phone should be beautiful, but it was not obvious 10 years ago. And that is made, that happens because of where you are in the trade-off between sort of price and cost and value. So when you have sort of functionality becoming very cheap and sort of not a competitive differentiator, one of the things that companies can do to get ahead of the competition is to invest in the look and feel of whatever they're selling.
So, this is kind of like GM could, distinguish itself from Ford by offering cars in different colors.
Right.
But by the same token, there's a mentality, right, that changes, because you get the impression, or certainly Steve Jobs probably unfairly would have said that Bill Gates never would have, gotten rid of putty-colored computer boxes.
Right. Well, there is definitely a very strong, particularly Anglo-American and particularly engineering tradition that says the look and feel of things is irrelevant. And the Marxist, there's a certain strand of Marxism that also says the look and feel of things is irrelevant. It's manipulation. All you should care about is, how many, what the clock speed is or whatever. You shouldn't care about how your phone looks. That is a very false view of what human beings value. And by the way, you don't have to be rich to care about these things. In fact, in sort of poor subsistence economies, a relatively high amount of resources goes toward bodily decoration, home decoration, et cetera, because those things are relatively cheap compared to getting refrigerators because you don't have electricity, or all these kinds of 20th century consumer durables that we associate with sort of progress in that old sense. So in terms of glamour, I argue glamour is like humor. It's old, it's universal. What happens in terms of change when you get modern in the sort of most general, not the 20th century sense, but sort of the historian sense, modern commercial cities at large scale, is you get a proliferation of types of glamour. So in the old days, you had military glamour, you had religious glamour, you had a glamour around seductive, beautiful women, and that was pretty much it. You get in the 19th century, and also with all those forms of glamour, the stakes are really high. It's about immortality. It's, whether like literally like eschatology, going to heaven, immortality, or whether it's like Achilles, living on in song and story. When you get the modern city, you get things like department stores, theaters. You start to see much more variety in the types of glamour, and they're much sort of lower stakes. Buy this rug and have
or this soap
this
will
soap
transport you away.
Right. These kinds of things that are and there's still that kind of sense of escape and transformation, but it's much sort of softened.
Here's a question for you. Escape and transformation from a kind of libertarian free market sensibility. I think you could argue that that's the whole point of capitalism. I mean, somebody like Schumpeter would talk about creative destruction and endless mutations. Part of what is kind of amazing about a capitalist economy is that you take things that aren't raw materials or services that aren't seen as being very valuable, and then you perform some kind of alchemy on them, and they become, good. I mean, you take base materials and you create steel or whatever, or you change a computer. It's the same thing on the inside, but suddenly it's worth a lot more because it's been transformed. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the role of kind of capitalism or markets or exchange and the growth of a kind of global economy?
Right. Well, one thing that, glamour, the proliferation of glamour accompanies that proliferation because you have many more people engaged in commercial persuasion, and glamour is one possible tool. It's not the only possible tool of that. You have a search for subjective value, economic value, and the meanings people attach on things through glamour, are another source of that. And then the other thing is, glamour is escapist. That's one of the and if you think, but it's escapist in this sort of deep sense that it allows you to imagine life in it's not distraction. It's not escape as distraction. It's a escape as imagining life different, almost making you more discontent. Well, the kind of innovation that is required to drive that sort of process you're talking about requires a similar type of imagination. So it doesn't necessarily require glamour. I mean, there are capitalists who are inspired by glamorous ideas of, what it would be to be an entrepreneur, or and in fact, I talk about Adam Smith talking about the son of a poor man who has this glamorous vision of what it would like to be rich, and as a result, he works hard all his life when he could have just been relaxing. But that ability to, or the sort of the feeling that the world could be different. Glamour requires this idea that the world could be different. It requires acknowledging discontent and entertaining a sense of possibility. And capitalism requires the same things. Or entrepreneurship or innovation requires the same things. It doesn't necessarily require glamour, but it requires that ability to imagine, to acknowledge that this is not the best of all possible worlds, that it could be better, and to picture some way in which it would be different and better.
Is there, one of the things that obviously, I mean, you write on a very regular basis and you blog. You were in one of the original kind of celebrity bloggers or political bloggers. But, is there a through line between your editorship at Reason, The Future and Its Enemies, the substance of style, and The Power of Glamour? Or how would you?
Right. It all come out of my brain. Well. To ground it sort of with reason and libertarianism are part of a bigger classical liberal tradition. And if you go back to the 18th century classical liberals, who are very much, very inspiring to me, Adam Smith, David Hume, and there are assorted others in the Scottish Enlightenment in particular, they wrote very profound things about the role of government and about how the economy works. But that is not the only thing they were interested in, and nor was it the thing that bound all their work together. They were interested in the imagination. They wrote about taste. They wrote about what it was like to live in this dynamic commercial society. And they wrote about, what does it mean to be a human being? And in ways that were informed by life in that type of society, as opposed to life in Aristotle's society.
And I mean, things were really opening up. I mean, we look back at the 17th or 18th century now. I don't think anybody would want to live then. I mean, it's so constrained, but from their perspective, it was wide open.
Right, and so my writing, all the different books, is in that tradition. It's asking questions about those issues, about what does it mean to live in a free and commercial society, a dynamic culture. What does it tell us about more enduring qualities of being a human being? What do the more human universals tell us about life in that society, that type of society? So that sort of curiosity about, kind of how those dynamics work informs all my work. I don't think the government is the most important or most interesting thing there is.
But it is important to try and get it right, both in terms of its size and scope, and then the institutions that it helps.
Right, absolutely, and going to the issue of glamour, and this is not a I suppose it's a deeply political book in the sense that it's anti-Marxist in its analysis or whatever, but it's not about politics. Right. But there's some elements in it that, if you think about, the growth of the administrative state in the 20th century, you can't really understand what was going on until you really understand the intense glamour that planning had in the first half of the 20th century, really up until the mid-60s. And I have this wonderful image in the book from a 1930 ad for a radio. The headline of it is "Under the Control of One Hand," and it's like this controller managing the highways of tomorrow, and it's advertising a radio dial. I mean, that's the actual good that's being sold. But it's advertising it with a very glamorous view of the future, and a glamorous view of the future where the glamour lies very much in a sort of orderliness and central control. And that's very important in understanding sort of why more classical liberal views of government were eroded. I mean, if you
well, and to kind of go back to The Future and Its Enemies, which I think had a profound impact on anybody who read it, and the kind of dichotomy you created between stasis, people who had a vision of a kind of fixed world order, and it was very much of that model of a single dial, versus dynamists, who were kind of more interested in open-ended, constantly changing tumult. Have we learned the lesson of planning? I mean, we're talking now. Yeah,
I mean, we have a different view of it.
I mean, it seems like there is a more profound sense of that you really can't know I mean, it seems like Barack Obama literally was the last person to be surprised that healthcare.gov flopped.
Right. And I wrote a column about the sort of database glamour, the IT glamour that we have, which is just it's a microcosm of the whole thing, but. There is this. If you go on TV tropes, you can find that on that database. You can find something called the magical database. Right. You watch TV, watch particularly crime shows, but there's always this sort of instant, easy access to information, and all the difficulties of putting together those things are hidden. And I really have the feeling that Obama and a lot of the other people in the administration thought that you could just sort of say, "Make it so." Right. didn't have any idea of how difficult just that little piece of the problem, which is putting together the database, the interface would be, which much less the whole, healthcare system.
What are the what is a kind of educational project in the broad sense, not in a particularly partisan political sense of, where we get people possibly to understand that, that's a true illusion, the idea that you're going to be able to kind of map every contingency with a single plan and then flip the switch and that's it, because that seems so juvenile. Certainly libertarians are always accused of being juvenile, but I know very few libertarians who just say, oh yeah, I've got the perfect answer and we'll never have to readjust anything. What goes into, obviously your books do, but what goes into that educational process to kind of get people to say, like, look, it's constant adjustments going forward because our desires change, our needs change, our worlds change.
Right. Well, I think a lot of it requires, more introspection and being honest about ourselves, and also realizing, it's often the case that you talk to business people, they understand like all the ridiculous aspects of regulation in their business, but then this guy over here, they really need to get that under control. It's not universal in either respect, but and so part of what you need to do, and it's not easy, is to, in a world where people are very specialized and we have this proliferation of subcultures and individual identities, and all of that's great, but you need to be able to somehow imagine that your experience is not universal. And I do it because I just know that I'm a very weird person. And so, the world is not mostly made up of people like me, and it's probably a good thing. But it's hard. And glamour is an interesting thing to think about in this context, because I think understanding glamour gives you a window into all kinds of motivations, and including your own. It also reminds you that there's always stuff left out. So glamour is much about the static picture, and libertarians are subject to that. They've been Galt's. We're all going to go live in Galt's Gulch, and that is a very.
And you'll never have to cut the grass again.
And that's a very
whatever.
glamorous idea, and it's very inspiring to people. But there's all kinds of stuff left out, and Rand was a person who was very affected by glamour, particularly the glamour of the movies. She used it extremely effectively and mostly positively in terms of her writing. She kind of screwed up her personal life because she couldn't tell the difference. But there's a reason why she was probably the most effective libertarian writer, as opposed to somebody like Hayek, who actually wrote something about socialism and utopianism, and it's too bad that the socialists have these inspiring visions for the future, and the young people like that. And I think what he was really getting at is like, we need glamour too, but actually there was a form of glamour that emerged within the libertarian movement.
As a final note, at the end of the book, you talk about your struggle or your battle against and victory over breast cancer, and you were helped by a drug called Herceptin, and you mentioned that you owe your life, or I owe my life, to the glamour of makeup and movie stars. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so first of all, I don't really think of it as like my battle against cancer, because I feel like it was like the oncologist's battle against cancer, and I was just like there. I was like the battlefield, but. So Herceptin is a real miracle drug. It's one of the few, there are a few, but it's one of the few real, transformative cancer drugs that have developed over the past couple decades through an understanding of the underlying biology of the cancer cells and a more specific, slightly more personalized version of cancer medicine. So instead of just saying there's breast cancer, you can identify different types of it. One of the things that's really interesting about Herceptin is how the basic research for it was funded. It was not funded by the government, and it was not funded by a traditional cancer charity. what happened was Lily Tartikoff, the widow of Brandon Tartikoff, who was famous from NBC.
Famous for the Mary Tyler Moore show.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. Yes,
yeah.
it's all related. It all comes back to TV. So the widow of Brandon Tartikoff went to his oncologist, who's a guy named Dennis Slayman, and said, I want to help you. I want to help raise money. I want to support you. What do you want? And he said, I have this idea for a kind of drug to treat a certain type of breast cancer, which is called HER2 positive. It has to do with certain characteristics of the cell, which is a very aggressive form of breast cancer with a pretty high mortality rate at that time. And this is in in the 90s. And so then Lily Tartikoff ran into Ronald Perlman at, I think, Spago. It was one of those real LA stories, and said to him, "Hey, you're in charge of Revlon. Revlon sells to women. You guys should help us out to raise this money." So Perlman, through his foundation, gave a lot of money, and Tartikoff and Perlman and others in Hollywood started having what were called fire and ice balls, which is named after a very famous Revlon ad campaign in the 60s. Maybe 50s. Every year, these fundraisers. And this is how Herceptin got funded. And my own personal oncologist played a role in this, was when a Revlon rep came to decide whether they should get involved with this. John Gillespie, who was my oncologist at UCLA, said to him, if we wait for the government to fund this, NIH, or National Cancer Institute, we'll have a Rose Bowl full of dead women before it gets funded. So that's how the basic research was done. It was through this private funding, and not, a lot of basic research in cancer is through private funding, but this was not through traditional cancer charity. And then Genentech was the company that actually took it through the trials, and it was quite a hairy, it was a young company. They're always betting the company on this. And it has had a remarkable effect on the prognosis for women who are diagnosed with HER2 positive breast cancer, particularly those like me who were diagnosed early on. According to Dr. Gillespie, given the characteristics of my specific case, these are not aggregate statistics, before Herceptin, I would have had a 50-50 chance of survival. And at the time I was diagnosed, I had a 95% chance of survival because of this drug. I had all the, and now I'm officially cured. So happy ending.
Right. Well, that is a very happy ending. So we'll leave it there. I want to thank Virginia Postrel, the author most recently of The Power of Glamour, Longing, and the Art of Visual Persuasion. Thanks so much, Virginia. For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.